The radio came on before she touched it, the way it always did at that hour, the announcer's voice filling the cab of the Ford pickup with the kind of news that changes the shape of a morning. Lehman Brothers Holdings Incorporated had filed for Chapter 11, bankruptcy protection, the largest such filing in the history of the United States. The announcer delivered this with the professional steadiness of a man reading words he did not fully understand, and beneath that steadiness was something that sounded almost like fear. Hazel Carver reached over and turned the dial. The cab went quiet. She drove west on County Road F58, 40 miles of cracked two-lane asphalt. She had traveled so many times the road had become a kind of memory in her hands. The October corn stood harvested on both sides, the broken stalks pale and thin in the early light, the fields exhaling the last of their warmth into a sky the color of old pewter. She was 68 years old and wearing a simple cotton dress and low-heeled shoes, the same outfit she wore every time she went into town on serious business. In her purse, folded once inside a plain white envelope, was a cashier's check drawn on an out-of-state credit union. It had been issued 3 days ago. It still faintly smelled of cedar. She did not turn the radio back on. She already knew everything the announcer was going to say. She had known this morning was coming. The way a farmer knows a storm is building, not from any forecast, but from the way the air sits differently against your skin, 2 days before the sky opens. The check in her purse was not a reaction to this morning's news. It was the final piece of a structure she had been assembling for 5 months. One quiet conversation at a time. One kitchen table at a time, built from the afternoon. A young man in a tailored suit told her to go back to the kitchen and let the professionals handle it. She had gone back to the kitchen. That was exactly what she had done. This is not a story about revenge. Revenge is fast and satisfying and burns itself out like stubble after harvest, and what it produces is ash. This is a story about something slower and more permanent. To understand what happened in Garrison County. In the autumn of 2008, you have to go back much further than that morning. You have to understand the land first. Garrison County covers 714 square miles of central Iowa, a place defined not by its towns, which are small and functional, but by the grid of its fields. Surveyors drew those section lines a century and a half ago with a cold geometric precision that imposed a kind of order on a landscape, which is in truth a continuous and unresolved negotiation between soil and water and weather. The soil is mostly Clarion-Webster loam, black and heavy and dense, with the compressed patience of 10,000 years. In a good year with the right amount of rain falling at the right intervals, it will give you 220 bushels of corn per acre. In a bad year, it cracks open under a brassy sun, the corn goes thin and dry on the stalk, and that black loam turns to a fine, choking dust that covers everything in a film of beige despair. The county had seen both kinds of years many times. It had learned to survive both. Hazel Carver had lived her entire life within 12 miles of the farmhouse where she was born. Her husband, Thomas, had been the farmer, in the oldest sense of that word, a man whose hands were thick calloused maps of a life spent wrestling with machinery and seasons and the stubborn refusal of living things to cooperate with the plans you made for them. He had loved the work with the uncomplicated dedication of someone for whom work and identity had always been the same thing. He died in the spring of 1994, a Tuesday in April, sitting in the cab of his John Deere with a cup of thermos coffee that had gone cold beside him. His heart simply stopped. The fields were already planted. Hazel had always thought he would have considered that a reasonable arrangement. She had been the other half of the operation for 31 years. Not in the fields, but at the table, she understood that a farm is not just productive land. It is a small and fragile business, perpetually exposed to global commodity prices and fuel costs and the temperament of a weather system stalled over the Rocky Mountains. She kept the books with a precision that would have satisfied any auditor, tracking costs and margins across decades, reading the cycles of expansion and contraction. The way you read the seasons, not as individual events, but as a pattern with its own deep and repeating logic. After Thomas died, she did not sell the land. She leased it by the season and kept the books and tended her heirloom tomatoes and ran the Lutheran Church's annual charity auction with a quiet authority that nobody had ever thought to question. But her real work, the work that would come to matter most, was recorded not in the farm's financial ledgers, but in 3 books kept inside a cedar chest at the foot of her bed. The first was her grandmother's. Its pages had gone brittle with age and carried the faint smell of old paper and lavender from the drawer liners her grandmother had favored. The handwriting moved across the page in a looping, elegant script, the confident hand of a woman who had learned to write in an era when penmanship was considered a reflection of character. This book covered 1916 to 1952. The second was her mother's covering 1952 to 1979, the handwriting more practical and hurried, less ornamented, the writing of a woman who had more to do each day than she had hours for. The third was Hazel's own, started the year she married Thomas, its pages filled in a clear and careful hand that had barely changed in 40 years. These were not financial ledgers in any sense that a banker would have recognized. There were no columns, no balance sheets, no formal accounting of debits and credits arranged in the institutional language of commerce. They were a record of a different economy entirely, one that ran not on interest rates and collateral requirements, but on trust and memory, and the accumulated weight of obligations extended and honored across generations. A typical entry from her grandmother in 1934 read simply, June 12th, Lent. John Miller 4 bushel seed corn for the South. 40 his was blighted by fungus. To be repaid at harvest 5 bushels or help with the barn roof. A note in the margin 5 months later, October 28th. 5 bushels delivered this morning also. 1 jar of Margaret's peaches, good man. A different entry from her mother in 1965. March 3rd. Gave the Hemmings $200 cash. Their boy has the fever, and the hospital is asking for payment before treatment. No interest. Repay when able. Below that in December of the same year. Mary Hemming brought a quilt she made herself, said cash payment to follow next year. Took the quilt as payment in full. It is beautiful and it will outlast us both. This was the system. Not charity. Not sentiment given a ledger to make it feel respectable. It was a closed-loop economy of mutual support, built on the deepest possible understanding of character and circumstance, maintained across 3 generations by women who understood that in a farming community, information about your neighbors was not gossip. It was risk assessment of the most precise kind imaginable. The Carver family had served for 3 generations as something between a clearinghouse and a long memory. They were never wealthy in any conventional sense, but they consistently held a small surplus of cash and seed and reputation, and they had learned over many decades that in a place like Garrison County, those 3 things were effectively the same asset in different forms. The core principle was not complicated to state, though it took a lifetime to execute with real skill. Diversity is strength. A community's only genuine asset is the people inside it. A man's worth was not the number on his credit application. It was whether he showed up with tools at 2 in the morning when a storm took out your fence line. It was whether his word carried the same weight at the end of a ruinous year as it did at the beginning of a profitable one. Hazel knew every family recorded in those 3 books. She knew who carried a drinking problem and who had the strength to carry it back under control. She knew who planned poorly, but worked without complaint. Which wife was the sharper mind for business, whose low field flooded every wet spring, whose well went dry, first in a July drought. This was data. Messy and human and impossible to format into a table, but more reliably predictive than anything generated by an algorithm, written in a distant office, by someone who had never watched a crop fail from the cab of a machine they were still paying for. The default rate, across 86 years of informal lending, was less than 0.1%. The county bank, for purposes of comparison, rarely dipped below 2. There was one entry. Unlike all the others, it was on the first page of the oldest book alone on the page, nothing above it and nothing below. Her grandmother had written it in a different ink, slightly darker, as though she had dipped the pen with more deliberation than usual. October 1918. Lent $800 to Garrison County Regional Bank. Farm credit collapsed after the armistice. No interest asked. No collateral required. They were good people then. I hope they remember. Hazel had read that entry every year since the book came to her. She had never told another living person it existed. She kept the reason close, even from herself. She had simply known the way you know certain things about the land, without being able to explain the knowing that the right moment had not yet arrived. March of 2007 brought different weather to Garrison County. His name was Brandon Mercer. He was 34 years old and carried a graduate degree from Northwestern University. And he had spent the previous 6 years working for a large agricultural lending institution in Chicago. He arrived to manage Garrison County Regional Bank with a mandate he made no particular effort to conceal. Modernize the operations, maximize return on assets. He wore suits that fit with a precision no garment in the county had ever achieved, and he spoke with the unwavering confidence of a man who had come to mistake a well-calibrated tool for wisdom itself. I was not a malicious person. That is worth saying plainly, because the story is not improved by making him into something simpler than he was. He came to Garrison County genuinely believing he was there to help. He looked at the bank's portfolio of agricultural loans built across decades on relationship and judgment, and the kind of knowledge you acquire by living alongside people for 30 years. And he saw inefficiency. He saw underleveraged assets. He saw a community that had not yet been properly introduced to the products available to it. He saw potential, and in his vocabulary, potential was always a word that meant the same thing. More. 1 week before Brandon arrived, Amy Gallagher came to work at the bank in her first professional position after college. She was 25 years old, the daughter of a farm equipment mechanic who had spent his career keeping other men's machinery running. She had grown up in Garrison County, left for 4 years to get a business degree from the state university, and returned to this job with the straightforward faith of someone who had not yet discovered a reason to distrust the systems she had been trained to work within. When Brandon Mercer walked through the door on his first morning and began reorganizing the office's physical layout, before he had met half the staff, she observed him with the guarded admiration of someone watching a person from a larger world operate in a smaller one. Brandon's first public act was to schedule a presentation at the Rotary Club. He needed the community to understand what was coming, and he needed them to feel favorable about it. The room filled as it always did for anything that touched the land, methodically and without haste. The way people come to important meetings when they already have their questions prepared. He had assembled 22 slides. He spoke of unlocking equity, optimizing capital allocation, variable rate instruments tied to the London Interbank offered rate, derivative positions designed to offset commodity price exposure. He used the word leverage 11 times in 40 minutes. The older men in the room received this with an expression that resembled polite attention, and was actually the face of people who had already heard the end of this particular story. They had seen his type before. Every 20 years or so, someone arrived in Garrison County with a new vocabulary and the same underlying proposition. Borrow more, grow faster, trust the model. And some years after that, man departed the same families appeared at the same courthouse with the same feeling in their stomachs. From the front row, Nora Weaver raised her hand. She was 60 years old, Earl Decker's wife, and she had helped operate a working farm for 4 decades without once mistaking confidence for competence. What happens, she said, when the algorithm encounters a bad year? A drought? A flood? Who decides then? Brandon Mercer produced the smile he used for questions he had already categorized. The model accounts for regional climate volatility at the macro level, he said. Nora held her eyes on him without blinking. That is not an answer, she said. He moved to the next slide. Several other hands went up in the minutes that followed, and Brandon answered each question with the same practiced fluency, the same vocabulary of abstraction, the same implicit message, that the people asking the questions simply lacked the sophistication to understand the quality of the answers being given. A man in the third row, Gus Palmer, 62 years old, third generation on 600 acres, asked what the model's recovery timeline looked like in the event of 2 consecutive loss years. Brandon said the model incorporated a dynamic adjustment mechanism calibrated to regional commodity indexes. Gus wrote nothing in his notebook which he had opened but never used. He looked at the man beside him. The man beside him shrugged slightly the small, definitive shrug of someone confirming a suspicion already held. In the parking lot afterward, Earl Decker found Hazel standing beside her truck in the last light of the evening, the western sky going copper above the near fields. Earl was not a man who made dramatic statements. He watched Brandon Mercer's rental car disappear down the county road and said quietly that the man either did not understand what he was selling or understood it too completely. Hazel looked at the road where the car had been. She said nothing. She gave the small, precise nod she reserved for conclusions she had already reached and saw no reason to announce. Nora Weaver came to stand beside them. She pulled her coat closed against the evening chill. She said she had asked the model question because she needed to hear how he answered it, not because she expected a useful answer. Earl asked what she thought. Nora said she thought they needed to pay closer attention to who was applying for loans in the next 6 months than they had in the previous 6 years. Nobody disagreed. They went to their trucks in the dark and drove home on roads they had known since childhood, each carrying the particular weight of a community, beginning to understand that something familiar had been replaced with something that wore the same name, but operated by different rules. Through the spring and into summer, Brandon rebuilt the bank's lending process from the inside. The old system had been built on judgment, formed by proximity, a loan officer sitting across from someone he had known since grade school, and making a decision that incorporated everything visible and invisible about that person's circumstances. Brandon replaced it with a centralized algorithm. Every application would now be processed through a proprietary model that weighed credit scores, debt-to-income ratios, and 3 consecutive years of tax returns. The character of the borrower, the quality of his land, the generational knowledge behind the operation, none of these were inputs. They were in the terminology Brandon used without apparent awareness of what he was communicating externalities. Amy Gallagher was assigned to help calibrate the model's input parameters. She sat with the data for 2 weeks, entering test cases, running scenarios, checking outputs against historical loan performance. She was methodical. On the 14th day, she found something that made her stop. The risk weighting applied to borrowers with more than 400 acres was substantially higher than the industry standard, higher even than the weighting assigned to borrowers with documented histories of late payment. She checked the figure 3 times from 3 different angles. It was not a rounding error or a miscalibration. It was a deliberate setting. She went to Brandon's office and described what she had found. He did not look up from his screen. "Working as designed," he said. She returned to her desk, opened a document on her personal laptop, typed the date and what she had observed, and saved the file to a drive she kept in a drawer at her apartment, rather than on any system the bank controlled. The first application that came through under the new system and got denied belonged to a young farmer named Pete Albright. No relation to anyone in particular. 29 years old. 90 acres leased from his uncle, trying to borrow $16,000 for a grain auger before the fall season. He had no credit history to speak of, but he also had no debt, and a written lease on productive ground, and a co-signer in his uncle who had banked at Garrison County Regional for 30 years. The algorithm declined the application in 48 hours. Pete Albright sat in the parking lot of the bank for a while afterward, not going anywhere engine running, the way a person sits when they have received news they knew was possible, but had not yet made real in their own mind. Amy Gallagher watched from her window. She opened her document on the personal laptop and added a new entry, "Word of Pete." Albright's denial moved through the county the way things move in small communities. Not announced, but present everywhere within days. A new data point that people filed alongside other data points and did not yet have enough of to see the pattern clearly. Clint Boone heard it at the feed store and noted it without comment. Earl Decker heard it from his son-in-law and mentioned it to Nora that evening, and Nora said she was going to start paying more attention to who was getting turned down and why. April of 2008 came in cold and muddy planting season, arriving with its annual combination of urgency and helplessness. Clint Boone had farmed the same 600 acres his grandfather had cleared from tallgrass prairie, and across 32 years of operating that land, he had not once been late on a payment to any creditor. His combine threw a connecting rod in late March, a failure that could not be repaired at any price that made mechanical sense. A replacement machine cost more than his current liquid reserves. Harvest was 5 months out. He needed a bridge loan of $75,000. He drove to the bank on a Monday morning, expecting what such a morning had always previously produced a brief conversation and a signature. He received a 16-page application instead. He filled it out with the patience of a man who has spent his life meeting requirements designed by people who have never done his work. He submitted it on a Thursday. The following week, a form letter arrived at his farm. The application had been denied. The model had flagged his debt-to-income ratio across the preceding 24 months as outside acceptable parameters. Those 24 months had been the 2 worst consecutive years for corn margins in a decade, a compression of collapsed prices and record fuel costs that had squeezed every operation in the county equally. The model did not hold this context. It did not know that Clint Boone maintained his equipment to a standard that any dealer in 3 counties would have endorsed without hesitation. It did not know his land was among the most consistently productive in Garrison County, or that his son was within 8 months of completing military service and returning to help expand the operation into additional leased acres already secured. The model knew the numbers on the page, and the numbers on the page were not sufficient. The Farmers Cooperative met the following: Tuesday evening in the back room of the grain elevator, the same room where these meetings had been held for 40 years. The same folding chairs, and the same industrial coffee, and the same ring of faces that had watched the county's fortunes change through drought and flood, and the slow, persistent erosion of margins. Clint Boone stood when the agenda reached new business. He was a compact and quiet man who did not speak in public without something to say. He held the letter in both hands and read it aloud from the first line to the last. Every clause, every bureaucratic qualification, every line of institutional language constructed to deliver rejection, without using anything that sounded like a human voice. When he finished, he folded the letter and sat down. The room did not erupt. It went quiet in the way of people who have just had something confirmed that they had hoped was not true. Amy Gallagher was seated near the back with a notepad she was no longer writing in. Earl Decker buttoned his coat and walked toward the door without speaking, and the sound of his boots on the concrete floor was the loudest thing in the room. Nora Weaver sat straight in her chair, with her eyes focused on a point just above the far wall. The stillness of someone deciding something privately that she would act on later without announcement. Gus Palmer turned his coffee cup in his hands and looked at the floor. 3 rows from the front, a man named Dale Finch put both hands over his face for a moment, not crying, just holding himself together in the way of someone doing arithmetic about their own situation and not liking the result. Hazel Carver sat at the end of the 3rd row and listened to the silence settle into the room, the way water settles into low ground, finding every corner, filling every space. She understood what she was hearing. It was not anger, though anger was in it. It was the sound of trust fracturing, which is quieter than people expect and considerably harder to repair. She drove home after the meeting on roads she had traveled 10,000 times, and for the first time in memory, they felt different under her hands. Not the roads themselves, which were the same cracked asphalt they had always been. Something in the act of driving them, as though the familiar had shifted slightly off its axis and was now showing her a version of itself she recognized, but could not entirely place. She passed the Boone place and saw a light still on in the kitchen window. She passed the Decker place and saw the barn doors standing open, which meant Earl was still working, although it was past 9. She passed 3 other farms and thought about the names in her ledger and what those names had built across generations and what it would mean to lose any of them to a process that understood none of it. She did not make any dramatic resolution driving those roads that night. She simply drove, and the decision that was forming in her did so without fanfare, the way the best decisions form below the level of articulation, in the place where you know things before you can say them. She drove to the bank 2 mornings later without announcing herself. She wore the same cotton dress and low shoes. She sat in the waiting area for 20 minutes before Brandon agreed to see her. His office was clean and impersonal, a large abstract painting on one wall that resembled a can of paint overturned on a surface, a flat monitor on the desk showing charts in multiple colors, a filing system so rigidly ordered it appeared to have never been disturbed by actual use. He gestured to the chair across from his desk with the practiced graciousness of a man who did not expect the conversation to require much of his morning. She presented Clint Boone's situation. the way she would present any proposition she meant to be taken seriously without decoration and without any appeal to sentiment. She described who he was, his history across 3 decades, the condition and productivity of his land, the son completing military service and returning within months to work the additional leased acreage already under agreement. She built the case piece by piece, the way you build anything intended to hold weight under examination. Brandon Mercer listened with his fingertips pressed together, his expression the arranged patience of a man waiting for something he had already decided would not alter his position. He leaned slightly forward when she mentioned the son. "That is anecdotal," he said. "I cannot input son returning from military service into a risk assessment model." Hazel looked at him without changing anything in her face. "Then your model," she said, "is missing the most important information." He produced the thin professional smile he used when a conversation had reached its conclusion without the other person yet recognizing it. He stood up and began moving toward the door. He paused there. He said the financial models his institution employed were highly sophisticated instruments representing years of quantitative development. He said this without condescension in his voice, which was perhaps the most revealing version of what he said next. "With all due respect," he told her, "perhaps you should go back to the kitchen and let the professionals handle this." He held the door open and waited. Hazel stood. She looked at him the way she might examine a soil sample, without feeling with complete attention, taking the full measure of what she was seeing. She gave the small, precise nod just once. She thanked him for his time in a voice that disclosed nothing. She walked past him through the door and out of the building into the ordinary April morning. The walk to her truck was 40 steps across a parking lot she had walked across hundreds of times. She counted none of them. She got in, closed the door, placed her hands on the wheel without starting the engine. The windshield showed her the main street of the town she had lived near. Near her whole life, the familiar storefronts and the elm trees that had come back after the blight, and the hardware store where Thomas had spent considerable portions of his adult life. She sat with the morning for a moment. Then she started the engine and drove home. She drove home on the county roads. She had known her whole life at the same unhurried pace she always traveled them. The spring fields were beginning to show green at their edges, the first tentative color after the long gray of winter. She parked in front of the farmhouse and sat in the cab for a moment without moving. Looking at the house her grandfather had built at the porch, her husband had repaired 3 times in 30 years at the kitchen window, through which she could see the heavy oak table that had stood in this family since before anyone living could remember. She went inside. She put the kettle on. She stood at the window while the water heated, looking at the fields to the west, in the late afternoon light, at the geometry of turned earth. Waiting for seed at the particular way the low sun came across that land and made it look like something a person would be right to fight for. The kettle began to whistle. She poured her tea. Then she went to the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. She lifted the lid. The smell rose up to meet her: cedar and old paper, and something faint and floral that had outlasted everyone who had first noticed it. She took out the 3 leather-bound ledgers. She took out the metal cash box and the cloth bag of gold coins. The reserve her grandfather had built 1 coin at a time across the years because he had believed correctly that paper promises burn in gold does not. She carried everything to the kitchen table and arranged it in the light. She opened her own ledger to the first blank page. She sat with the pen in her hand for a long moment, not writing anything yet, looking at the table and the books in the afternoon, moving slowly across the floor. He had told her to go back to the kitchen. He had said the professionals would handle it. She had been working in this kitchen for most of her 68 years, and at this table she had built something that no professional school had ever thought to teach, because it required the one thing no curriculum had found a way to quantify. She picked up the pen and began to write. She did not drive to Des Moines to pick Millie up. She called and said, "Come home this weekend, I need help with something." And when Millie pressed for details, she said simply that there were 3 books on the kitchen table that needed a second pair of eyes. Millie arrived Saturday morning in a sensible, compact car with a laptop bag over one shoulder, and the look of a young woman who had already prepared a reasonable explanation for why her grandmother's plan, whatever it was, would not work the way her grandmother believed it would. She was 24 years old and had graduated the previous spring with a business degree from the State University. She was bright in the way that good education produces brightness, which is to say, she had acquired fluency in a set of analytical tools and come to mistake the tools for the thing they were designed to measure. She loved her grandmother without reservation. She found the 3 leather-bound ledgers deeply touching, in the way you find old photographs, touching as evidence of a world that no longer operated by its own logic. When Hazel described what had happened to Clint Boone and the meeting with Brandon Mercer and what she intended to do about it, Millie set her coffee cup down with the careful precision of someone choosing their next words. "It is just risk management, Grandma. They have to protect their depositors. It is not personal." Hazel looked at her granddaughter across the table, where 4 generations of this family had made every consequential decision available to them. She did not argue. She did not correct the statement, though it was wrong in the specific way that educated people are sometimes wrong confidently and from first principles. She said only that she needed help this weekend with something, and she would explain in the car. They drove out to the Decker place on a Saturday morning with the county roads still damp from an overnight rain. The fields on both sides carrying the particular smell of turned earth and spring moisture that Hazel had known her whole life, and that Millie had spent 4 years in a dormitory trying not to miss. Earl Decker came out to meet them before the truck had fully stopped. He was 65 years old and built like the work that had made him broad through the shoulders and slow in his movements in the way of men who have learned that efficiency is a better investment than speed. He had farmed this ground since he was 19 years old, and he knew Hazel Carver the way you know someone whose family history is inseparable from your own. Hazel opened the second ledger on his kitchen table and placed her finger on an entry her mother had written in the spring of 1965. Earl's father had borrowed $500 to buy a replacement bull when his breeding stock was lost to a fever that moved through the county in February of that year. He had repaid the loan in full the following October in cash and had helped Thomas Carver re-roof the main barn the following summer. Earl looked at the entry for a long time. His voice when he spoke was quiet and aimed at the middle distance rather than at Hazel directly. "My dad said your mother saved us that year. We would have lost the whole operation." Hazel told him what she needed. Not a donation. Not charity extended in one direction out of sentiment. An investment in a structure she was building backed by land and by a record of obligation honored across 80 years. The bank paid 1.8% on his certificate of deposit and charged his neighbors 7.5% on what it lent them. She was proposing a different arrangement. From the kitchen doorway, Nora Weaver appeared, still wearing her work apron, her hands still damp from whatever she had been doing before they arrived. She had been listening since the second sentence. "How much?" she said. Earl began to speak, and she said his name once the way wives of 40 years say a name when they have already arrived at the answer and simply need their husband to catch up. 40,000, Earl said. Nora turned and went back to the kitchen without further discussion. Millie wrote the number in her notepad and stared at it for a moment, as though checking it against something she was not certain she had computed correctly. The following 3 weeks moved at the pace of gravel roads and kitchen coffee, and the slow, honest conversations that happen when the stakes are real and there is no reason left to be indirect about them. Hazel drove the county with the 3 ledgers on the seat beside her, and Millie in the passenger seat with her laptop open, building a model that began as skepticism and converted itself entry by entry into something she did not yet have a name for. At the Simmons place, Hazel sat across from Roy Simmons, a man of 72, who had farmed 80 acres of bottom ground that flooded in wet years and dried to concrete in dry ones. Land that appraisers had long since stopped pretending had market value. She placed the cloth bag of gold coins on his table without explaining what she wanted first. She told him she knew what the land had meant to his grandfather, who had broken it, from river willow and marsh grass in the first years of the last century, and she told him she was not asking him to sell it. She was asking him to hold it inside a structure that would make it useful rather than merely symbolic. Roy held the bag in both hands, feeling the weight of it. "Same price," he said finally. She said, "Same price." He put the bag down and pushed it back toward her across the table, which was not a refusal. It meant he had decided, and the money was no longer the point of the conversation. Millie watched from the truck because the porch screen door had not opened far enough to suggest she was included. She watched through the window as Roy Simmons sat with his hands flat on his table for a full 2 minutes after Hazel pushed her chair back, and she found herself unable to explain what she was observing, using any framework she had been given in 4 years of classroom instruction. On the 4th week, they drove to the farmstead of a woman named Vera Lattimore. She was 79 years old, had been a widow for 11 years, and operated a 160-acre farm with the help of a hired man who came 3 days a week and her own 2 hands on the other 4. Her husband's name appeared twice in Hazel's grandmother's ledger and 3 times in Hazel's mother's, and Vera herself appeared twice in Hazel's own, once in 1989 when the Lattimores had lent seed corn during a failed delivery, and once in 1997 when Hazel and Thomas had quietly guaranteed a note at the co-op after a bad spring. Vera met them at the screen door before Hazel had raised her hand to knock, which meant she had been watching from the window and had already made her decision before they got out of the truck. She poured coffee without being asked and set out a plate of oatmeal cookies that she had clearly baked that morning, which was its own kind of statement. She waited for Hazel to open the ledger, and she looked at the entries when they were shown to her. Her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, her finger moving slowly along the lines. Her husband's handwriting in the repayment notes. Her name in Hazel's neat script. Hazel told her what she was building. Vera listened without interrupting, which was more than most people managed. When Hazel finished, Vera removed her glasses and folded them on the table. She said she had $22,000 in a savings account. She had been putting off deciding what to do with since Harold died, and that she had been putting it off because none of the options available to her felt right. She said this felt right. She opened the drawer of the kitchen table, which was the drawer where important papers lived in every farmhouse Hazel had ever visited, and took out her checkbook. Millie sat with her coffee and did not say anything for a long time after they left Vera Lattimore's driveway. Then she said it quietly, not as a discovery, but as a confirmation of something she had been approaching from several directions for 2 weeks. She said she thought she understood now what the ledgers actually were, not records of transactions, records of character. Hazel kept her eyes on the road. She said, "Yes, that is what they are." The visit to Walt Henderson was the one that cost something. Henderson was 55 and ran a clean operation on 340 acres. Not a large farm by county standards, but a disciplined one. And he had the precise and guarded manner of a man who had survived previous losses by learning to question propositions that arrived carrying the weight of someone else's conviction. He sat with his arms folded when Hazel opened her ledger. His wife Donna sat beside him without speaking. Hazel made the same case she had made 10 times before, with the same quiet and factual delivery, without pressure, without the particular emotional weight that would have made it feel like manipulation rather than proposition. When she finished, Walt unfolded his arms to reach for his coffee cup and folded them again when he set it back down. He said he had heard from a man in Ames who had heard from someone in the investment community that there was already a fund from Chicago interested in the bank's portfolio. He said he did not see how a group of farmers with a coffee can of savings was going to outmaneuver a city fund that moved that kind of capital before breakfast. He said he was sorry, Hazel, he hoped it worked, but he could not put Donna's security at risk on a proposition that had never been tested. Hazel did not argue. She thanked him for the coffee and stood up. Donna walked them to the porch. As Hazel reached the bottom step, she heard the screen door open behind her. She turned. Donna Henderson was standing in the doorway with an envelope in her hand, her coat still on from having not yet removed it after coming in from the morning chores. She walked to Hazel and placed the envelope in her hand without speaking. $15,000, she said quietly. Her voice was even and private, the voice of a decision already made and not available for revision. Walt will come around. He just needs time to get there himself. Millie stood at the truck and watched the Henderson place recede through the back window as they drove away. After a mile of silence, she said, "That woman, just bet her marriage on you." Hazel kept her eyes on the road. "She did not bet it on me," she said. "She bet it on her land." They drove the rest of the way home without talking. Millie opened her laptop in the driveway and did not go inside for 20 minutes. The spreadsheet Millie built was not what she had expected to build when she drove home that first Saturday morning. She had expected to find the model wanting. She had expected the numbers to reveal what her instinct had already concluded, that this was a generous idea, grounded in sentiment rather than a sound structure, grounded in evidence. Instead, the numbers told her something different. 23 families. Total committed capital approaching $5 million. Land assets in trust providing a collateral base that made the loan-to-value ratios conservative, by any standard she had been trained to apply. The historical default rate, drawn from the ledgers which she had digitized entry by entry, with increasing attention over 2 weeks, was so close to zero that she initially assumed she had made an error in the formula. She had not made an error. The digitizing had taken her 4 evenings, sitting at the kitchen table with the oldest ledger open beside her laptop, reading each entry aloud under her breath as she typed it in. She had expected the work to feel archaic, the transcription of a system that belonged to a different age. Instead, she found herself slowing down as she went deeper into the books, reading more carefully, reconstructing the human situations behind each entry. A $30 loan in 1921 for fence wire, repaid in labor during wheat harvest. A guarantee extended in 1938 that kept a family from losing the North 40 during the worst drought year on record. A 1944 entry in her grandmother's hand, noting that the Pendleton boy had gone to the Pacific and that she was holding the family's seed corn in her own barn until he came back. He came back. The entry below it, dated November 1945, said simply, "Roy Pendleton returned. Corn delivered in full. Welcome home." She sat with that entry for a long time. She had a framework for risk and return and collateral value, and none of that framework had a field for what she was reading. She did not delete the framework. She built a second sheet behind it, one that tracked the entries as social data, mapping relationships and obligations and repayment patterns across 8 decades. The 2 sheets together produced something that her financial training had no name for. She left it unnamed. The number it produced was what mattered, and the number was sound. She sat with the model for a long time after she confirmed the numbers. She ran stress tests. She modeled the drought scenario. She modeled the flood scenario. The structure held under each one. She felt something shift in her thinking that was not comfortable and was not quick, and did not announce itself with any obvious drama. It arrived the way the light changes in late afternoon gradually, and then all at once, until you realize the room looks entirely different than it did an hour ago. She called a professor from the university, a man who had spent 20 years studying financial instruments applied to agricultural markets. She described the pattern she had found in the loan denial data, the concentration of refusals among large acreage operators, with the strongest productive histories, the risk weighting that diverged from any published standard she could locate. She asked him what he saw. He was quiet for long enough that she thought the call had dropped. "That is not a modeling error," he said. "Someone changed those weights by hand. You would not do that by accident, because the algorithm would flag any deviation above a certain threshold. You would have to override the flag." She asked him what it would mean if someone had done that deliberately. He told her what it would mean. She wrote it down without speaking and thanked him and sat with the phone in her lap, looking at the wall of the room she had grown up in. She called Hazel at 1 a.m. She said it carefully and completely, and without the particular voltage of someone announcing a catastrophe, because she had learned that her grandmother received important information better when it was delivered the way her grandmother delivered everything, without decoration, with precision. She said the algorithm had been adjusted by hand to fail a specific category of borrower. The category was not defined by creditworthiness. It was defined by land value. The algorithm was designed to produce a particular outcome, and the outcome it was designed to produce was a concentrated set of high-value agricultural mortgages in technical default or near default status, which would in turn give the bank a documented basis for urgently liquidating the portfolio. Hazel said, "I know." Millie was quiet for a moment. She said, "You knew." Hazel said she had suspected it since she reviewed the early denials. The pattern was too consistent to be statistical noise. Millie asked why she had not told her. Hazel said because you would have gone to the authorities directly, and they would have taken 18 months to investigate something we cannot afford to wait 18 months for. Millie felt the heat of something that was partly anger and partly the particular sting of discovering that someone you love has been protecting you from information you deserve to have. She is not wrong, she thought. That is the worst part. She asked how much time they had. Hazel said 2 more families to secure and 1 piece of paper from inside the bank that she was waiting on. Millie asked what piece of paper. Hazel said she was not yet certain it would arrive. "When it does," she said, I will know it is time. Millie sat with the phone in her lap for a long time after the call ended. Then she opened the spreadsheet again and began building a second sheet behind the first, a running record of the algorithm's deviations from standard dated, sourced formatted in a way that could be read and understood by someone who had never seen the inside of a loan application. She did not know yet who it was for. She built it anyway. The man named Jason Roth arrived in Garrison County in late July and took a room at the county's only motel, a 2-story building with 28 rooms and a parking lot that held the kind of vehicles you did not typically see in that part of Iowa. His was a black sedan with Illinois plates. He carried himself with the contained and practiced ease of someone who moved in and out of small towns, often enough to have developed a technique for making himself temporarily unremarkable. He met with Brandon Mercer twice in 3 days, once in the bank after hours, and once at the small bar at the far end of the main street where the lighting was insufficient, and the corner booth was far enough from the nearest occupied table to be effectively private. Amy Gallagher was in the motel lobby on the second morning, dropping off a printed reservation confirmation for an external auditing team scheduled to arrive the following week. She recognized Brandon's voice through the glass door of the breakfast room and paused on the sidewalk before entering. Through the glass, she could not see the second man clearly, only that he was leaning across the table with the posture of someone delivering, rather than receiving information. She heard 3 words clearly before a passing truck obscured the rest. 6 cents and deadline. She went inside, dropped the envelope at the front desk, and left by the side door. That evening, she opened the document on her personal laptop. She typed the date. She typed the words she had heard, and then she typed in careful full sentences everything she had observed across 7 months of working inside a process that had been constructed to produce an outcome she had not until recently understood. She had been saving these entries for a purpose that had not been clear to her when she started. It was clearer now. August arrived and brought no rain. The corn was tasseling under a sky that had not produced meaningful precipitation in 6 weeks, the leaves beginning to roll on themselves in the afternoons as the plants conserved what moisture remained in the soil. Farmers walked their fields in the evenings with the particular gait of men who are calculating losses they cannot yet name. The news from the wider country was getting worse in the way that financial news gets worse gradually, until suddenly, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac now requiring federal intervention, the language in the reports becoming more careful and more alarming, in the same sentence. Millie read everything she could find every night and built the numbers into her model, adjusting her stress scenarios. Watching the basin of risk in the county's situation grow wider, while the walls around it held. The night before, Brandon Mercer came to the farm. Hazel sat alone at the kitchen table with the ledgers open and the cash box beside them, and the cloth bag of coins that had come back from every family she had visited. She worked the numbers in the way she always worked numbers by hand, first in columns checking each sum twice before moving to the next. She added the committed capital from all 23 families. She added the appraised value of the land parcels placed in trust. She set this against her best estimate of what the portfolio would require. Then she sat with the result for a long time without moving. She was $240,000 short. She had extended everything available to her. The families in the ledgers had given what they could give without jeopardizing themselves, and to ask for more would be to convert what was a proposition into a demand, which was the one thing she would not do. The coins were gone into land. The cash reserve that 3 generations of Carver women had maintained against the worst possibilities was committed. There was no additional source she had not already visited. She did not stand up. She did not pace the room or open the ledgers to look for a name she had missed. She placed her hands flat on the table, the same table, and looked at the light from the window lamp, falling across the grain of the old oak, worn smooth by the hands and elbows, in grief, in celebration of 100 years. She sat with the shortfall the way a farmer sits with weather. It exists. You cannot argue it into a different number. What you can do is wait and see what the morning brings. She opened the first ledger to its first page and read the entry her grandmother had written in October of 1918, one more time. $800 to the bank. No interest. No collateral. They were good people then. She closed the book, turned off the lamp, and went to bed. She was in the garden the next morning, with her hands in the soil beside the tomato plants, when she heard gravel in the driveway. The black Audi with Illinois plates had not been in the county before, and she did not look up from what she was doing when its door opened. She heard the footsteps cross the gravel and stop at the garden fence. She kept working. Brandon Mercer had taken care with his appearance, which she recognized as a mistake. People who arrive at a farm in a freshly pressed shirt are advertising that they have come to perform rather than to accomplish. He told her he had been made aware of certain activities she had been conducting in the county. Cancuned the solicitation of investment from local landowners for purposes that could constitute operating an unlicensed financial institution under Iowa code, which would expose her to considerable legal liability. He said this with the measured gravity of someone who had rehearsed it. She moved to the next plant. She worked a handful of soil loose around the base of it and pressed it back in more firmly. She asked him whether he was there as a banker or as a man who was afraid. He said he was there to advise her that continuing these activities would create serious legal exposure for herself and for the families who had participated. She pulled a small weed, examined it, set it aside. She told him she knew this county. She knew who owned what land and who had held it through every difficulty the previous century had sent their way. She told him that a man who drives 4 hours to frighten an old woman in her garden is a man who has run out of other options, and she could see, from the amount of time he had spent on his appearance this morning, exactly how much time he believed he had left. She turned back to the plant and did not look at him again. He stood at the fence for another moment. Then she heard the gravel again, and the car door and the engine. He left believing he had delivered a message that would slow what he had seen. Building in the county for 3 months. He had not understood and would not understand until it was too late that he had delivered a different message entirely. He had told her the timeline. He had told her by his urgency and his choice of this particular morning that whatever he was waiting for was very close now. She had read him the way you read weather, not from what he said, but from the pressure behind it. The dust settled back onto the driveway before she straightened up and looked at the place where the car had been. Millie was standing at the kitchen window. Hazel could see her outline through the glass, absolutely still watching. She picked up her trowel and moved to the next row. She did not tell Millie about the shortfall that night. She sat with her at the kitchen table while Millie walked through the spreadsheet again. The committed capital, the land, assets, the stress-tested scenarios. All of it sound, and all of it. By $240,000, not yet enough. Millie said the numbers work. Grandma and Hazel said yes, they do. She let it stand there. The following Sunday, she attended the early service at the Lutheran church, the way she had attended every Sunday for 60 years. She sat in her customary pew and sang the customary hymns and accepted the brief handshakes of the customary congregation. She was making her way toward the parking lot afterward, the autumn sunlight coming flat and low across the churchyard, when she heard her name spoken quietly behind her. She turned. Amy Gallagher stood alone on the side path that ran between the church building and the fellowship hall, wearing a coat that was slightly too light for the morning's temperature. She looked as she had looked for several months, Hazel thought, like someone who had been carrying a weight they were not certain they had the right to put down. "I cannot give you documents," Amy said. "I cannot testify to anything in any official proceeding without losing everything, and I need you to understand that. But I have been writing things down for 7 months, and I need you to know what I know." She described Jason Roth and the number she had heard. She described the audit team scheduled and the fact that Brandon had taken 2 calls from Chicago in the last week that he had not taken in his own office. She said she did not know the exact date, but she thought it was very soon. Hazel asked her why she was telling her this. Amy looked down at the stone path for a moment. She said that Clint Boone's daughter had been her closest friend in 4th grade, and that they had ridden their bikes up and down Clint's driveway on summer afternoons until the light gave out, and that she had sat in the back of the cooperative meeting and watched Clint Boone read that letter out loud, and she had not slept well since. She said she thought what Brandon Mercer had done was wrong in a way that her professional obligations could not make right. They stood for a moment in the side light of the churchyard. 2 women, 20 years apart in age, the older one looking at the younger one with an attention that was neither scrutinizing nor forgiving, but something more useful than either. Then Hazel thanked her, gave her hand a brief and firm press, and walked to her truck. That night, she sat at the table one more time with the spreadsheet Millie had printed and the ledgers open around it. She looked at the number that was still $240,000 short. She sat with it for a long time, her hands around a cup of tea that had gone cold. The shortfall had not changed. The mathematics had not developed a new opinion. There was no family she had not yet visited, and no reserve she had not yet committed, and she was still $240,000 short of the number she needed. She turned off the lamp. She went to bed. At 11:47 in the evening, her phone vibrated on the nightstand. She read the message once, and then read it again. It was 4 words. Tomorrow. He signs it. She recognized the number as one she did not have saved in any directory and would not be saving afterward. She set the phone face down on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling of the room where she had slept for most of 68 years. Then she picked the phone back up and called Millie. "We move tomorrow," she said. "But there is something I need to tell you first." She reached over and turned on the lamp. She opened the first ledger to the first page, to the entry, written in October of 1918, and she read it aloud to her granddaughter for the first time in her life. When she finished, the line was quiet for a long moment. Then Millie said very carefully, "We saved that bank once already." Hazel said yes. "And we are $240,000 short of being able to buy it back." Another silence, longer this time. Then Millie said, "What time does Walt Henderson's farm road reach the county highway?" Hazel said it was about 1.5 miles north of the church on the east side. Millie said, "Give me 45 minutes." She ended the call. Hazel sat in the lamplight and did not put the first ledger away. She kept it open on the table beside her, the 1918 entry facing up. Outside the window, the October fields were invisible in the dark, but she knew every inch of them by memory, knew where the low ground collected water, in spring, and where the soil ran deep, and where the fence line needed attention in the northwest corner. She had known this land her whole life, the way you know the face of someone you have loved without interruption. The phone rang. Not a text, this time a call, and not Millie's number. She answered. It was a woman's voice, composed and quiet, and slightly out of breath, as though she had walked from the house to the end of the driveway to make the call. 240,000, the voice said. "Tell me where to bring it." Hazel closed her eyes for a moment, not with relief, but with something that had no name in any language she knew. The feeling that comes when the land gives back exactly what you put into it, and you understand for the first time that you always knew it would. She told Donna Henderson to come to the farmhouse in the morning, 9 o'clock, and to bring Walt. Walt Henderson arrived at 8:40 in the morning with Donna beside him in the cab of his pickup. He did not come inside immediately. He sat in the truck for a moment after Donna got out his hands on the wheel, looking through the windshield at the farmhouse and the fields behind it, and whatever calculation he was still running in some back room of himself. Then he opened the door and got out and came up the porch steps without being asked. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had argued with himself through the night and arrived at a position he had not expected to hold, not defeated by the argument, but changed by it. Hazel had coffee on, and the table cleared of everything, except a plain notepad and a pen. She did not make any acknowledgement of what his presence had cost him. That was not the kind of household she ran, and besides, the time for acknowledgement was not this morning. She poured coffee, set the cups down, sat across from them. Walt put the envelope on the table and pushed it toward her. His hands were a farmer's hands, scarred along the knuckles and permanently stained at the cuticles with something no amount of washing entirely removes. She looked at the envelope and then at him, and he looked back at her with eyes that had not slept much and had arrived through that sleeplessness at a place that was beyond negotiation and into something simpler. He said he did not want an explanation or a reassurance. He wanted to know one thing. He wanted to know whether she believed they could win. Not whether the numbers worked, and not whether the structure was sound, and not whether the legal standing was established, whether she believed it. She picked up her coffee cup. She told him she had believed it since the afternoon. She sat in this kitchen with 3 old ledgers and a metal box, and understood that the bank had made a very specific mistake. It had assumed that the thing it was about to take from this county in the discount was something this county did not know how to value. She set the cup down. She told him to drink his coffee because they needed to leave in 20 minutes. Millie came downstairs at 8:50 with her laptop bag over her shoulder and the composed steadiness of someone who has been awake since 3 in the morning and made their peace with that. She looked at the Hendersons at the table and did not express surprise. She poured coffee she did not drink and stood at the counter, going through something on her phone, with the focused attention of someone verifying a fact they are about to rely upon in a room where it will matter. Then she showed the screen to Hazel without speaking. Hazel looked at it and nodded once. The Garrison County Land Trust had filed its articles of organization with the Iowa Secretary of State's office at 9:14 in the morning on September 13th, 2008, 2 days ago. The filing was acknowledged, numbered, and time-stamped. It was a legal entity. It existed in every sense that the law recognized, and it had existed for 48 hours before anyone at Garrison County Regional Bank had thought to question whether it would. They left in 2 vehicles at 9 o'clock. The October morning was cold and still, the kind of morning that arrives in central Iowa, like a statement of intention. The sky, a hard pale blue, above fields stripped bare, the light coming in, long and flat from the east, with no softness in it whatsoever. Hazel drove her Ford pickup and did not turn the radio on. She already knew what the radio was saying. The news of Lehman Brothers had reached every speaker in the county by now, and what it was producing in people was the particular vertigo of watching something vast and institutional and apparently permanent reveal itself as neither. She had been watching that particular vertigo building for 2 years. This morning it was simply the weather, and she had dressed for it. When they turned onto the main road into town, she could see the other trucks ahead of her. 3 of them, then 2 more behind. She had told Nora Weaver to bring whoever felt called to come, and she had said this without pressure, which is the only way to issue an invitation you actually want people to accept. She had not expected this many. She looked at them in the rearview mirror and did not count them again. 12 people walked into the lobby of Garrison County Regional Bank at 9:15 on the morning of September 15th, 2008. They were men and women whose families had banked in this building across 3 generations, whose deposits constituted the foundation on which every loan in that portfolio had been made, whose labor was the only reason the land those mortgages were written against had any value at all. They were wearing work clothes, the clothes you wear on a Tuesday when you have been in the barn since 5:30 and have another 6 hours ahead of you, and they sat down in the upholstered chairs along the lobby wall with the unhurried deliberateness of people who have nowhere else to be, and no intention of pretending otherwise. The lobby was polished marble and high ceilings and a chandelier that someone in a previous decade had believed conveyed permanence. Against that backdrop, the 12 people in work boots and faded denim produced an effect that no interior designer could have calculated, and no institutional training prepared a bank employee to manage. They were not protesting. They were not demanding. They were simply present, and their presence had a weight that settled into the room and changed the air in it. The way weather changes air, not through any single element, but through the totality of pressure. A teller at the far window looked up once and looked away again. A young man in a tie appeared from the hallway, assessed the situation with visible discomfort, and disappeared back the way he came. Earl Decker sat in the chair nearest the door, with his hands resting on his knees. The posture of a man who has done hard physical work for 45 years and knows how to be still when stillness is required. Clint Boone sat 2 chairs down, his hat held in both hands, looking at the floor with the expression of a man who is trying to maintain something and is succeeding at the cost of everything available to him. Nora Weaver sat straight eyes forward. Beside her, Walt Henderson sat with his arms folded across his chest. Not the defensive fold of earlier days, but the settled fold of a man who has arrived somewhere and is not leaving. Vera Lattimore sat at the end of the row, with the particular stillness of someone who has outlived enough crises to know that the ones worth surviving require patience more than noise. Gus Palmer sat near the window and looked out at the street and the familiar buildings of the town. His family had shopped in for 3 generations. Donna Henderson sat beside her husband and did not reach for his hand, though they were close enough for it. They did not need to. In the glass-walled office at the far end of the lobby, Brandon Mercer looked up from his monitor and saw them. Hazel watched him look. She watched him see Clint Boone and Earl Decker and Nora Weaver and the 8 others. And she watched his face move through several distinct calculations, and she watched the calculations arrive nowhere useful. Then she turned and walked to the reception desk and said she had an appointment with Raymond Locke. Locke's office was on the 2nd floor and had a window that looked out over the county road rather than down into the lobby, which was the kind of architectural decision that now seemed, in retrospect, to have always been pointing toward this specific morning. He was standing when she came in, which she noted. A man who stands when you enter has either been raised well or is preparing for something. In Raymond Locke's case, it was both. He was 67 years old and had been in banking his whole professional life the last 19 years in this building, and he carried the posture of a man who had seen enough to stop being surprised by things and had not yet stopped being bothered by them. Brandon Mercer was already seated. And in the chair to his left, which had not been there during Hazel's previous visit, sat Jason Roth. He was perhaps 40 years old and had the groomed and watchful appearance of someone who spent his working life in rooms where significant money moved and had learned to present himself as though he were simply a neutral observer of that movement rather than its primary beneficiary. He held a leather portfolio on one knee. He did not stand when Hazel entered, which she also noted. Millie came in behind her and took the remaining chair, without being invited to sit, opened her laptop and set it on her knee without turning the screen toward anyone yet. Brandon glanced at her with the brief assessment of someone who had discounted her twice already and was preparing to do so a 3rd time. Hazel set the white envelope on Locke's desk. She did not open it yet. She told Locke she understood the bank had been directed by its parent institution to liquidate its agricultural mortgage portfolio. and that the current market for such instruments made the effective value considerably below par, and that she was there to make an offer for the full portfolio at its current market value. She said this the way she said most things, without decoration, and without the kind of performed calm that announces itself as calm, which is always the least calm version of the quality it is attempting to project. Brandon said the portfolio's outstanding principal was just over $52 million, and he said it with the deliberate patience of someone placing a number in a room to make other numbers feel inadequate. He said the bank was entertaining serious offers from qualified institutional parties. He did not look at the envelope. Roth leaned forward slightly. He said there was in fact a prior engagement with his firm at a negotiated rate, and that this engagement was at an advanced stage of documentation, and that Mrs. Carver's appearance here, while appreciated, was perhaps a matter of unfortunate timing. Hazel asked him what rate. Roth's right hand moved once on top of the leather portfolio, his cents on the dollar, he said. She looked at him for a moment without any particular expression. Then she opened the envelope and removed the cashier's check and set it on the desk in front of Raymond Locke. She told Roth she was offering 9 cents drawn and certified present in the room. She told Locke it was good for the next 5 minutes. The room underwent the particular recalibration that rooms undergo when something real has entered them after an extended period of things that were only resembling real. Roth looked at the check. Brandon looked at Locke. Locke looked at the check in the way of a man confirming that it contains the number he suspected it contains, which it did. Brandon said that regardless of the differential in offered price, the Garrison County Land Trust lacked the recognized legal standing to function as a purchasing entity in a transaction of this complexity, and that any agreement executed with a non-qualifying party would expose the bank to significant fiduciary liability. And he said it with the practiced fluency of someone who had prepared this argument the night before and believed he was going to need it. Millie turned the laptop screen toward him. The filing timestamp. Read 9/14, September 13, 2008. The articles of organization, the registered agent, the entity number, assigned by the Secretary of State's office, all of it present, and in order all of it, time-stamped 48 hours before this morning. Brandon looked at the screen. He looked at it for long enough that the looking became its own kind of statement. Then he looked at Millie, and she met his eyes without adjustment, and he looked away first. Roth stood up. He said there were preliminary agreements in place that predated this morning's discussion, and that those agreements had legal standing of their own, and that the bank's board would need to review all outstanding offers before any commitment could be made. He said this with the flattened effect of someone who has begun the process of withdrawing from a room before their body has started moving. Locke had not spoken. He sat behind his desk with the check in front of him and looked at it, then at Hazel, then past both of them through the glass wall of his office. From here he could see the lobby below, the 12 people in work clothes, still sitting in the chairs along the wall, not looking up, not making any demonstration of impatience or demand, just present. Earl Decker sat with his hands on his knees. Clint Boone sat with his hat held in both hands, looking at the floor with the expression of a man who is trying to maintain something and is succeeding at the cost of everything available to him. Nora Weaver sat straight with her eyes forward, the stillness of someone who has made every decision already made and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. Locke looked at them for a long time. He looked at them the way you look at something when you are allowing yourself to fully understand what you are seeing, without the buffer of professional distance, without the vocabulary of institutional process, interposed between you and the plain fact of the thing. Then he said he needed a moment alone with Mrs. Carver. Brandon looked at him. Roth looked at him. Locke looked back at them with the steadiness of a man who has finally decided something. He had been deciding for 8 months, and finds now that the decision is made, that there is nothing complicated about it at all. Brandon and Roth left the room. Millie stood, and Locke shook his head, and she sat back down. The room was quiet. Locke looked at the check and then at Hazel. He told her he had known what Brandon Mercer was doing since January. He said the mandate had come directly from the parent corporation's risk committee in Chicago, and that the board had been briefed and had approved the asset disposition strategy, and that he was a figurehead in his own building and had been for 3 years, and that he had told himself this was simply the way the industry had evolved, and that his discomfort with it was a personal problem rather than a professional one. He said he had told himself that until he could no longer tell himself that, and the point at which he had been unable to continue was the night after the cooperative meeting when Clint Boone read that letter out loud. Hazel looked at him without interruption. He said he had no authority to override a board decision. He said he had looked for a mechanism for 6 months, and there was none available to him within the structure he operated inside. He said he needed her to know that he had not been comfortable. She told him she believed him. She said discomfort that stays private is a private matter, and this morning he had the opportunity to make it something else. She said it the way she said all the true things, without apology, and without softening the kind of statement that lands harder, precisely because it arrives with nothing wrapped around it. He picked up the telephone. He told his assistant to prepare the transfer documentation for the full agricultural mortgage portfolio, all tranches, all outstanding instruments to the Garrison County Land Trust, effective immediately, and to call the bank's legal counsel and have them in the conference room in 1 hour. He set the phone down. He looked at the check one more time, and then looked out the window at the county road below at the flat October fields visible beyond, the last buildings of the town at the sky above all of it, holding its cold blue without apology. This county, he said quietly, almost to himself, deserved better than what it got from us this year. He did not appear to expect a response to this, and Hazel did not provide one because it was not the kind of statement that is improved by commentary. When Brandon Mercer came back into the room, he already knew. Hazel could see it in the way he moved the particular stillness that replaces animated confidence, when it drains out of a person quickly and leaves the structure standing without what had filled it. He stood near the door. He looked at Locke once and looked away. The Ivy League fluency was still available to him, she noted, if he had needed it, but he appeared to have concluded that there was no arrangement of words available to him in this room that would produce a different outcome from the one already in motion, and he was correct in that conclusion. Roth gathered his portfolio and left without speaking, and there was something almost admirable in the efficiency of his exit, the practiced competence of a man who loses and departs quickly, rather than slowly, which is the more dignified version of the two available options. The check cleared before noon. $4,718,324.16, drawn on a credit union in a neighboring state and smelling of cedar, transferred in exchange for the full agricultural mortgage portfolio of Garrison County Regional Bank on the morning that Lehman Brothers filed for Chapter 11 protection, and the largest financial institutions in the world discovered that the thing they had built was not the thing they had believed they were building. The 12 people in the lobby did not cheer when Hazel came down the stairs. They stood, and that was all the slow rising of people who have been sitting with something difficult and are now standing with something different, which is a movement that contains more than any more obvious expression of feeling would have managed. Clint Boone put his hat back on, Earl Decker buttoned his coat. Nora Weaver took Hazel's hand for a moment and released it, and in that release was the acknowledgement of everything that had been extended and everything that had held. Walt Henderson stood at the back of the group and looked at his wife, and then at Hazel, and then at the floor. Donna put her hand briefly on his arm. He nodded once to himself, and that was enough. They went back to their farms. There was work still to do. Brandon Mercer spent the following Monday morning in his office with the door closed. Amy Gallagher knew this because she could see the door from her desk, and she found herself watching it. The way you watch a thing you know is going to change before the end of the day, and are not certain what it will look like when it does. At 11 o'clock, he came out carrying a box, not a large box, which was its own commentary on the weight of what was leaving. The Northwestern diploma, the pen set, a framed photograph she had never been close enough to identify. He walked past her desk without stopping. Then he stopped. He turned back. He looked at her for a moment, and she looked back at him, and what moved between them was not anger, and was not guilt, and was not quite forgiveness either, but was something more honest than any of those, which was simply the mutual acknowledgement of two people who had operated inside the same situation and made different choices and were now standing on opposite sides of those choices, looking at each other across the distance that those choices had made. He nodded once. She nodded back. He walked out. The parking lot held his car for 10 minutes, and then it was gone, and the space where it had been held ordinary gravel and nothing more. 3 weeks later, an email arrived at Amy Gallagher's work address, which was the only address available in any directory from a sender she recognized. It said the Garrison County Land Trust was in the process of establishing its operations and was looking to hire someone who understood both the numbers and the people behind them, and that if she was interested, she should call the number at the bottom. She read the email twice. Then she opened a drawer in her desk at the bank and took out the personal laptop she had been keeping there for 7 months and set it on top of her work computer, side by side, looking at both screens for a moment. She typed 2 sentences on her personal laptop. The first said, "I am in." The second said, "I kept the records." Everything I observed dated and signed and saved to a drive that does not belong to this institution, ready to produce, if it is ever needed. She sent it. Then she began writing her resignation letter, which was the shortest professional document she had ever composed and required no revision. October came in cold and full, and the harvest that followed was not the harvest the county had feared. The drought had taken something, but the land had given back more than the worst projections had allowed for, as land does, when the people working it have not been forced into the particular, desperate economy of the over-leveraged cutting corners on soil amendments and equipment, maintenance, and the 100 small investments that do not show up in a quarterly report, but show up in the yield numbers over a decade. The Garrison County Land Trust restructured every mortgage in its portfolio in the first 30 days. The terms were not charity. They were built on the same principle as the ledgers, which was that a system's resilience is a function of its flexibility under pressure, rather than its rigidity in comfort, and that a community's productive capacity over time is worth more than any single year's maximum extraction from it. Payments were tied to actual yields. Good years produced more than the minimum. Bad years produced what they could produce, and the trust recorded the difference without penalty, in the understanding that the land would come back and the people working it would come back with it, provided they were not broken in the interval. The drought of 2008 became the flood of 2009. The Copper River, which ran along the county's eastern edge and in normal years was a modest working waterway of no particular drama, rose 11 feet in 4 days after a week of unrelenting rain in May, and spread across the low ground of 3 townships with the indifferent authority of water that has decided to go somewhere. Fields that had been planted were underwater. Equipment parked in low sheds was submerged to the window line. County roads washed out in 4 places and were impassable for 2 weeks. In 3 surrounding counties, the combination of the prior year's drought losses and the flood damage produced a wave of foreclosure proceedings that moved through the farm community, like the water itself, taking everything that was not anchored deeply enough to hold families whose operations had been leveraged to the margins. Under terms that offered nothing when the seasons turned, were forced to sell land their grandparents had homesteaded, to settle accounts with institutions that had no mechanism for patience and no interest in developing one. In Garrison County, the trust moved family by family through the crisis. Dale Finch, who had sat at the cooperative meeting with his hands over his face, doing arithmetic about his own situation, called the trust office on a Tuesday morning in June, with water still standing in his lower 40, and his tractor disabled by flood damage, and his seed corn for the replant not yet purchased. Millie drove out that afternoon. She sat at his kitchen table with the file on his mortgage and the flood damage assessment and a calculator, and she and Dale worked through it together, not Millie presenting and Dale receiving, but both of them building the picture from its actual pieces. The trust deferred his payment for the season. It extended a short-term loan at 0 interest for the replacement seed. It connected him with 3 other farmers in the county who had dry storage available and were willing to share equipment at cost. Dale Finch did not lose his farm. His son farms it today. There were others like Dale Finch, more than a few, and the trust worked each situation as it arrived, which is not a system that produces elegant charts or satisfying quarterly reports, but is a system that produces farms still standing when the water goes down, which is the only metric that actually matters to the people who live inside it. In Garrison County that year, there were no foreclosures, not a single one. The trust bent under the pressure of both years. It did not break. It had been built from the understanding that what is rigid breaks, and what is uniform is fragile, and that the only structures worth building are the ones designed to absorb the full range of what the seasons can deliver. Nora Weaver joined the Trust's first board of directors in November of 2008, not because anyone had suggested she would be good at it, though she would be, but because she came to the first organizational meeting and sat down at the table and began asking the questions that needed to be asked, and nobody present had a reasonable argument for why she should be doing this from outside the room rather than inside it. She brought to those meetings the same quality she had brought to every difficult situation her 40 years on a working farm had produced, which was the ability to distinguish between what was actually happening and what people were describing as happening, a skill more rare and more valuable than any credential available to the educational system. When a loan application raised a question she could not resolve from the financial data alone, she drove out and looked at the land and talked to the family and came back to the next meeting with the information that the file had not contained. The board learned quickly that her assessments were reliable in the way that the old ledgers had been reliable, rooted in the actual, rather than the projected weighted by context, rather than by category. Millie Carver did not return to Des Moines. She applied her business degree to the Trust's operations with the precision of someone who has found the work that the tool was built for after years of using it, for tasks that were only approximately right. She built analytical frameworks that married the historical character assessments of the ledgers with modern soil science data and regional weather modeling, creating something that was not quite like anything the agricultural lending industry had seen before, because nothing in the agricultural lending industry had been built from 86 years of handwritten social intelligence and tested against the actual outcome record of the families it described. The default rate in the trust's first 3 years of operation was 0.04%. She published nothing about this methodology because publishing was not the point. The point was what the number meant. The afternoon. She understood fully what she had built, what her grandmother had built, what her grandmother's mother had built. Before that, she sat for a long time at her desk in the small office the trust had taken above the hardware store on the main street of the county seat, and looked out the window at the flat October fields, and felt the weight of a particular kind of inheritance. Not the weight of burden, but the weight of something solid underneath you that you had not fully appreciated until you felt it hold. She had come home that first Saturday morning, prepared to explain why the numbers would not work, and the numbers had not only worked, but had worked better than anything she had been trained to build. She thought about the 4 years she had spent learning to trust the instrument and distrust the music. She thought about the ledgers. She thought about Vera Lattimore opening her kitchen drawer without hesitation and taking out her checkbook. She called Amy Gallagher into her office. She had a file folder on the desk with the first loan the trust had formally processed. Amy had prepared the paperwork. Millie opened the folder and looked at the first page. She asked Amy if the borrower had been notified. Amy said he had been called that morning and told to come in at 2 o'clock. Millie looked at the clock. It was 1:57. Clint Boone knocked at the door at 2 o'clock exactly, which was not surprising to anyone who knew him. He came in with his hat in his hands and sat in the chair across from Millie's desk. He was 58 years old and looked every year of it, the way men look when they have spent their lives outdoors and working a condition that is simultaneously older and more permanent than the same number of years lived inside a building. He looked at the file folder on the desk and then at Millie. Millie slid the folder across to him. He read the first page slowly. He was not a slow reader. He simply read the way you read something you want to make certain you are reading correctly before you allow yourself to react to it. $75,000. Purpose Combine Harvester. Interest rate 0%. Repayment terms upon harvest amount to be determined by actual yield. Realized no penalty provision for any growing season in which total revenue falls below operating costs. He read it a second time. Then he set the folder down on the desk and looked at the wall behind Millie's head for a moment. When he looked back, his eyes were wet, in the way of a man who has held something together for a long time under circumstances that did not make it easy. And the wetness is not weakness, but is what holding looks like when the pressure finally releases. He put his hand flat on the folder. He said he would pay interest. He said the document said 0, but he would be paying something because he did not take without giving back. That was not how he had been raised, and it was not how he intended to die. Millie said that was between him and his conscience, because the contract said what it said. He said he understood what the contract said. He said he would pay anyway. She handed him the pen. That evening, Hazel Carver came to the office. Millie had asked her to come. The building was empty except for the two of them, the last of the October light coming through the window and lying in long, warm rectangles across the floor. Hazel was not dressed formally. She had come from the farm in the clothes she wore for ordinary days, and she moved through the office, the way she moved through everything, taking it in without hurry, without performance, reading the room the way she read land for what it was rather than what it intended to present. On the desk were 4 leather-bound books. The first 3 Millie had arranged from oldest to newest, the progression of handwriting, across a century, visible in the way they lay the oldest going. soft and slightly warped at the edges, the newest still crisp at the spine. The fourth was new, purchased from the same bookbinder in Ames, who had made the others the same dimensions and the same binding in the same quality of paper, inside blank from the first page to the last. Millie picked up the fourth book and held it out to Hazel. Hazel looked at it for a moment and then looked at Millie. The question in that look was clear, and Millie answered it before it was spoken. She said this one should stay with the trust's records. She said the others belonged to the family and always would. But this one was a different kind of document for a different kind of institution, and the person who should write the first entry in it was the person who had built the institution. Hazel took the book. She sat down at the desk, which was not her desk, in the office that was not her office, in the organization that existed in the form it existed in, because 3 generations of women had carried a set of principles forward through everything the preceding century had sent against them. She opened the book to the first page. She looked at the blankness of it for a long moment, not hesitating, simply acknowledging it the way you acknowledge the beginning of a field before you begin to work it. Then she picked up the pen. She wrote the date. She wrote the name. Clint Boone. She wrote the amount, $75,000, and the purpose and the terms, and in the margin where her grandmother had written "Good man" after John Miller, repaid his 4 bushels of seed corn 90 years before she wrote the same 2 words. Good man. She set the pen down. She closed the book. She put her hand flat on the cover and held it there for a moment with her eyes closed, not praying and not commemorating, simply feeling the weight of the thing in the way you feel the weight of work that is done and done correctly, which is a specific and irreplaceable kind of satisfaction that has no substitute available to it. Then she opened her eyes and stood up and told Millie it was getting late and they should both eat something. Several years passed in the way that years pass, when they are filled with the ordinary and necessary work of maintaining what you have built. Not dramatically and not easily, but steadily, in the way that the best things are maintained. The trust expanded. It made small business loans to the hardware store and the feed supply operation, and the family that opened a diner on the main street after the previous one closed. It financed a new truck for the volunteer fire department, the old one having been coaxed through one winter too many, on goodwill and mechanical improvisation. It funded 3 college scholarships in the first year and 4 in the second, and when the scholarship committee met to choose recipients, Nora Weaver sat at the table and asked not only about grades and test scores, but about character and family situation and what the applicant intended to do with the education they were asking to be funded, which was the question the Ledgers had always asked before any other. The money moved in the way that Hazel had always understood. Money should move in a place like Garrison County in a closed loop that stayed within the community and built capability there, rather than extracting returns for shareholders in a city that could not have located the county on a map without assistance. Amy Gallagher became the trust's loan officer and brought to the work the particular combination of skills that the job required, and that the job had, and in some sense, been waiting for her to develop. She understood the numbers with the fluency of her training, and she understood the people with the fluency of having grown up among them, and she had learned through the experience of the previous year that these 2 kinds of knowledge were not different ways of seeing the same thing, but complementary instruments that together produced a picture neither could produce alone. She kept her records carefully. The file on the drive in her desk drawer was never needed in any legal proceeding, because the question it had been prepared to answer was settled before it could be asked. She kept it anyway because she had learned that the difference between a community that survives a crisis and one that does not is often less about resources than about the quality of its memory. The oak table at the Carver farmhouse had been in the family long enough that nobody alive could say with certainty when it had arrived or who had made it. It was simply there the way certain things in old farmhouses are simply there, part of the structure of the place, in a way that predates memory. It had held every significant event. The family had known the grief and the celebration and the long ordinary evenings that make up most of a life. The planning and the grieving and the meals taken in. Silence after a hard day and the meals taken with laughter after a good one. Millie was sitting at it on an afternoon in the late fall, several years after everything that had happened, when her daughter climbed into the chair beside her. The girl was 8 years old and had been named Hazel by parents who understood what they were doing when they did it. She had her great-grandmother's eyes, the quality of attention in them that Millie had noticed her whole life. The gaze of someone who is fully present in the moment they are occupying and does not appear to find this effortful. She had her great-grandmother's habit of watching a room, before entering it, of listening to what was being said beneath the words being spoken of, sitting still long enough for people to forget she was there, and then asking the question that revealed she had been paying attention to everything. She looked at the 4 leather books on the table with the uncomplicated curiosity of someone who has not yet learned to pretend things do not interest her when they do. Millie opened the first book. The pages were the color of old cream. The ink faded to brown in the oldest entries. The looping script of a woman dead for decades, filling the lines with the authority of someone who had known the value of what they were recording while they recorded it. She found the entry from 1934 and pointed to it. She read it aloud. June 12th. Lent John Miller 4 bushels seed corn, his blighted. To be repaid at harvest, 5 bushels, or help with the barn roof. October 28th. 5 bushels delivered, and 1 jar of Margaret's peaches. Good man. The girl listened with her chin in her hands. She asked what seed corn was. Millie explained the whole of it, the planting and the harvest, and the way a single blighted crop in a single season could undo the work of years, if there was no one willing to bridge the gap. The girl considered this. She asked why they gave it to him if he owed them from before. Millie looked at her daughter and thought about this question, which was the right question, the one that had the whole of everything inside it. She said they gave it to him because when your neighbor's field fails, your own harvest is at risk eventually, and the people who understood that earliest and held to it longest were the ones who still had farms when everyone else had lost theirs. She said the most valuable thing a person can own in a place like this is not land and not money, though both matter, but a name that people trust, and that name is built one kept promise at a time across a life, and sometimes across more than one life. The girl took this in without rushing it. She looked at the 3 older books and then at the newer one, the 4th, and asked which one was newest. Millie pulled it across and opened it to the first page. The girl read the first entry, slowly, her lips moving slightly, the way she read everything she was reading, carefully rather than quickly. She read the name. She read the amount. She read the terms. She looked up at her mother. She asked who Clint Boone was. Millie told her. She told her about the combine and the letter and the cooperative meeting and the reading aloud. The girl listened with the quality of attention that was her great-grandmother's gift to her through the blood. When Millie finished, the girl was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if they still did this, whether people still helped each other this way, still kept the records and remembered the obligations and showed up when someone's field went wrong. Millie pulled the 4th book a little closer. She opened it past the first entry to the pages that followed, the entries that Amy and Nora and Millie herself had added over the years, each one in a different hand, each one in the same tradition. Dale Finch and his flood-damaged lower 40. Vera Lattimore's granddaughter. First in the family to go to college scholarship, awarded on the basis of a character assessment that would have looked familiar to anyone who had read The Oldest Ledger. The new diner on Main Street opened by a family who had no collateral except a lifetime of knowing everyone in town and being known in return. The volunteer fire department's truck for which no collateral was asked and none was needed. She let her daughter read the pages. The girl turned them slowly, not skimming reading each entry with the same care she had given the first. When she reached the last written page, she stopped and looked at the blank pages that followed the white expanse of what had not yet happened, and was quiet for a long moment, in the way of someone understanding for the first time that a story is not finished when you stop reading it. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window, the way it always came at that hour in that season flat, and golden and patient, the kind of light that has been traveling a long distance to arrive at this particular surface and does not appear to regret the journey. The dust moved in it, the way dust has always moved in the light of farmhouse kitchens, unhurried and suspended, going nowhere, and in no particular hurry to arrive there. The girl reached out and touched the page of the oldest book with the tips of her fingers very gently, in the way children touch things they understand to be old and are not yet old enough to be careless about. The ink beneath her fingers had been written by a woman born in the previous century in a kitchen, not unlike this one at a table that may or may not have been this same table. The girl could not know what it had cost to write those words, or what it had meant to keep them, or how many times across the following decades those words had been the difference between a family that survived and one that did not. She knew only that they were old and that they mattered, and for an 8-year-old that is enough. That is in some ways the most honest response available. Millie said yes. They still did. She said it simply and without elaboration because the answer did not require elaboration. It required only the doing of it, which was already in motion, had been in motion since October of 1918, when her great-great-grandmother dipped her pen with more deliberation than usual and wrote $800 and no interest asked, and I hope they remember and had not stopped since. Outside the kitchen window, the October fields ran flat and dark to the horizon. The soil turned and resting, holding in its patient dark interior everything it would give back in spring to the people who had learned how to ask it correctly. The light was going now, the gold, deepening to copper, and then to the long blue shadow that arrives in the last minutes of an Iowa October afternoon and turns the whole world briefly the color of something valuable. It would be dark in 20 minutes. There was still work to do. There always was.